Now that we've found how to find the characteristics from both the equation and the graph, we're going to use those skill sets to help us create an equation from the graph. So when we're finding the equation of the graph, we need the amplitude, which is our A value. We need the B value, which we get from the period. So remember, the period is 2 pi divided by B. And we need the midline, which is D. Okay. The way that we decide if it's sine or cosine is based on where it starts. So if it starts in the middle, or the top or the bottom. So if it starts at the top or the bottom, this is really what I wanted to highlight. If it starts at the top or the bottom, it's cosine. And then if it starts in the middle, it's sine. Okay. Now, this is really important, and one of the most frequent errors is that B and the period get either mixed up or they think that they are the same thing. Okay? So our B is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. That's the thing that's multiplied by the variable inside the function. Okay? And then we have the period, which is how long the one wavelength is. And that's 3 middles for sine, or top to top, or bottom to bottom if it's cosine. Okay. The period we don't actually use in the equation. Okay. The B value is in the equation, but not the period. Now, we also have, if we've got the period is 2 pi divided by B, well, we can use the B value to get to the period, but we can also use the period to get to the B value. So if I solve this for B, I need to get the B out of the denominator, so I'm going to multiply both sides by B. So we have B times the period equals 2 pi. Well, we're trying to get B by itself, so I want to undo timesing by the period, so we're going to divide by the period. So then B is 2 pi divided by the period. So we also have this equation. So I remember the period and the B can be swapped and be true equations. So when we're looking for these, we need to use our skill set from the other day where we talked about how to find the min and max to get to the amplitude and the midline. Okay. So for this one, when we're looking at this one, we've got our max is at 5 and our min is at -1. Right? So once you have your max and your min, that means you can at least get your amplitude and your midline. So if our max is at 5 and our midline is at -1, the amplitude is going to be max minus min cut in half. So 5 minus a -1 cut in half, which is 6 halves, which gives us 3. The midline, there's a whole bunch of ways you can get the midline, and some of you will be able to just blatantly see the midline off of the graph. Okay? But the midline, you can do the min plus the amplitude. You can do the max minus the amplitude, or you could do the min plus the max cut in half. Okay? So anyway, my personal preference is to do the minimum, which is -1, plus the amplitude, which is 3, which gets us to 2, which is our D value. So the A is the amplitude is the A value, the midline is the D value. So now we have 2 of our 4 letters that we need, because remember our equation is A sine BX minus C, plus D, or cosine here. Yeah. So we have 2 of our 4 letters. We've got our A and our D. So now here I want to figure out what the B value is. So the B value is either 2 pi divided by the period, or it's how many cycles happen from 0 to 2 pi. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look here, and I'm going to say, okay, well, we're starting the middle. So if I count how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi, notice I don't even have a full cycle here as I've made it to 2 pi. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the period instead, and then when I've found the period, use B as 2 pi divided by the period to find out what the B value is. Okay? So remember that 3 middles is 1 cycle for sine. So since we started at 0 in the middle, I'm going 3 middles. So that means that this is our wavelength or period, which is 8 pi. So if the period is 8 pi, that means we can use that B is 2 pi divided by the period, which is 2 pi divided by 8 pi, which the pi's cancel, and then 2 eighths reduces to 1/4. So our B is 1/4. Now, if we go back and we look from 0 to 2 pi, you can maybe see that this is a quarter of the sine wave, right? Because we've got this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece. So 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. So from 0 to 2 pi is a quarter, so our B value is a quarter. Now, when it's less than 1 full cycle, I prefer to find the period and then use this to find the B value. I think it's a little bit more precise and easier. Also, there are some where you won't be able to tell where it like stops here-ish, and you're like, well, I don't know exactly what portion of the graph that is. So that's why I like this method here. Okay. So now we've got A, B, and D. The C value, which we haven't really talked about, is our horizontal shift. So in this case, we're starting at 0. So that means that our horizontal shift is nothing, right? Because we've gone neither left or right from our normal starting position. So we're at 0. Okay. From your graph to the equation are opposite signs. So you would shift the opposite direction inside the parentheses, just like we do with all the rest of our graphs. Or you can think from the graph to the equation is opposite signs, or from the equation to the graph is opposite signs. Either of those ways of thinking is fine. Okay. So now we have our A, our B, and our C, and our D. So now I just need to decide, is this sine or cosine? Well, we're starting here in the middle, which means that it's going to be a sine. So then I need to decide, well, is it positive sine or negative sine? Remember, our positive sign goes up first. Our negative sign goes down. So this will be a positive sine graph. So now I'm going to put all 5 of those pieces of information together. So we have y is the amplitude, which is 3. It's a positive sign, so the positive goes with the 3, which is the A value. The B is 1/4. Then it's x minus 0, and then plus our midline, which is D, which is 2. Now, I can simplify this x minus 0 to just be x, so then this is really 3 sine 1/4 x plus 2 equals our y. Now, I could have also used theta as my variable. That would have been fine as well. Now, just so you are aware, there's an infinite amount of ways to write the trig equations for sine and cosine. That's because, if you notice, if I start here, this gives me a positive cosine graph that's been shifted right by 2 pi. So I could also create an equation where it's a cosine, a positive cosine graph, but it's been shifted by 2 pi. But the amplitude, the midline, and the B value will remain the same regardless of how you're writing your equation. So if I were to write an equation for the red one, we would have y equals, it's a positive cosine, the amplitude is still 3, the B value is still 1/4, but this time I've shifted right by 2 pi. So we're at positive 2 pi, so to the equation we change the sign, so x minus 2 pi, and then plus the midline, which is 2. Okay. I could have also chosen to write this as a negative sine wave and shifted right by 4 pi. Right? So there's a plethora of ways that you can write your equation. Since it's easiest to start at 0, my guess is most of you would just prefer to start at 0 instead of shifting it over, but just be aware that that's a possibility. Okay? Now, if we look at this one, we still want to find our min and our max. So pause, find your min, max, amplitude, and midline. Okay, so you should have those 4 things found. Remember, it's advantageous for you to try things so that you know if you're doing it right or wrong. You can practice that skill set. So our max is at 5. Our min is at -1, so that means that the amplitude is 5 minus a minus 1 cut in half, so 6/2, which is 3. The midline, I like to do the min plus the amplitude, so that gives us 2, which is our y equals y, which is our D value. So now we have 2 of our 5 pieces of information, including if it's sine or cosine. So the B value is we count how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So we're looking from here to here. So I don't care about this part over here or this part over here because this was before 0 and this is after 2 pi. So I'm just counting what happens in between my red lines. So in between my red lines, I start in the midline, and I go one cycle. So we're in the middle, so I go 3 middles. So there's 3 middles. So then I'm going to count another one, 3 more middles, and then I have another one, go 3 more middles, and then I have another one, and then that gets me to 2 pi. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, so our b value is 4. Now because we're writing the equation, I don't actually care what the period is because the period does not go in the equation. So I don't need to find it. It would be 2 pi fourths, which would go to pi halves, but I don't actually need to find that. Okay? So we now have 3 of our 5 pieces of information. Well, our c value, we're starting at 0, so I'm not shifting left or right at all, so our c value is 0. Okay. The ones we're looking at today all have the possibility of starting at 0. You could not start at 0 if you wanted to, but they all have the possibility of starting at 0. We'll look at some more later where it's not starting at 0. Okay. So then I need to decide, is this sine or cosine? Well, since we're starting in the middle, that means that it's sine. So I'm thinking, okay, well, if we go up first, then that is a positive sine graph. So then I'm going to say, okay, y equals the amplitude, which is 3. It's a positive sine. The b value is 4, x minus 0, and then plus our midline, which is at 2. Okay. Again, x minus 0 can just simplify to x, so we get 3 sine 4x plus 2 is our shortened or simplified version of the equation. Okay. So let's take a look at this one. Okay. Again, pause the video, see if you can find the amplitude, midline, max, and minimum. Okay, so let's check and see what you got for your max, min, amplitude, and midline. Okay, so the max is at 1, the min is at -3, so that means that the amplitude is 1 minus a minus 3 cut in half. So 4 halves, which is 2. So the midline is going to be the minimum plus the amplitude, which is -1, which is our d value. I like to do a quick spot check and be like, is my midline in the middle? Make sure I didn't do any weird arithmetic errors. Okay. So then we've got 2 of our 5 pieces of information. So I'm going to figure out the b value. Well, the b value, I'm only counting from 0 to 2 pi. So I only care about the parts that are in between my red lines. So I don't care about these over here. So this one starts at the bottom. So I go bottom to bottom is 1 cycle. Then I start at the bottom again, bottom to bottom is a 2nd cycle. Start at the bottom again, bottom to bottom is a 3rd cycle. And there I'm stopping because that's where my red line is. Or we're stopping at 2 pi because that's where the red line is. So in this case, our b is 1, 2, 3. Again, we don't need to find the period. We just need the b value for the equation. The period would be 2 pi thirds because we do 2 pi divided by the b, which is 3. So then I got to decide, okay, well, where's our c value? Well, in this case, we're starting on our x value of 0, right? I haven't shifted left or right at all. I haven't gone this way. I haven't gone this way. I'm starting at 0, so our c is 0. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, this one starts at the bottom. Well, is that sine or cosine? Well, sine has to start in the middle, so it's not sine. So that means it's cosine. Well, since we're at the bottom, does that mean it's positive cosine or negative cosine? Well, if we're starting at the bottom, that's a negative cosine. I like to think of negative cosine as a frowny face and positive cosine as a smiley face. Okay. So this is a negative cosine graph. So now we put all of those pieces of information together. So y is a, which is the amplitude, which is 2. It's a negative cosine, so the negative goes with the 2. The b is 3. We're shifting left or right by nothing, and then plus a -1. So when I simplify this, we can go to y equals -2 cosine 3x, and then plus a negative, plus a negative turns into -1. Okay, see if you can find your minimum, maximum, amplitude, and midline again. Pause the video. Okay, so let's check. So you've got your max here as at -3.5. Your minimum is right here, which is at -8.5. So that means that our amplitude is negative 3.5 minus a minus 8.5. Cut in half. So remember, a minus turns to a plus. So we have negative 3.5 plus 8.5, which gives us 5. And then we're cutting that in half, so 2.5. The midline will be the min, which is the negative 8.5, plus the 5/2, which is 2.5. So if we do negative 8.5 plus 2.5, or 5/2, then that gives us negative 6. Okay. I do a quick little check. Negative 6 looks like it's in the middle, so we're good there. So see if you can figure out what the b value is or the period, whichever way it was easier on this one. So pause the video, figure it out. Okay, so we now should have the period or the b value. So in this case, we're looking between 0 and 2 pi for what the b is. Okay, well, between 0 and 2 pi, I have not even gone, okay, sorry, I was distracted by trying to find which color I hadn't used. I've not even gone a full cycle, because one full cycle is between, or from top to top. Okay. Now, hopefully you can see that this is half of a cycle, because we've gone from top to bottom. So you could have found that your b value is 1/2 from the picture, or you could have found that, okay, well, if we're starting at the top and then I go to the top, then that means that this right here is our wavelength, which is the same as the period. So then the period is 4 pi. So then that means that the b is 2 pi divided by the period, which is 2 pi divided by 4 pi, which simplifies to 1/2. Okay. So either way, we get to the point where our b is 1/2. Okay. So then we need to decide, is this sine or cosine? Okay. So this starts at the top, which means it can't be sine. So then it's cosine. So then we got to decide, well, is it positive cosine or negative cosine? Well, this looks like a happy face, so this is positive cosine. So then we put all of this information together. So y is the amplitude, which is 5/2. It's a positive cosine. The b value is 1/2. I'm starting at 0. Oh, I forgot to mention that part. We're starting here at 0, so our c is 0. We've not shifted left or right at all. Right, so x minus 0, and then plus our midline, which is a negative 6. So then when I simplify this, it can just turn into 5/2 cosine 1/2 x minus 6, because plus a negative is a negative. Okay. You also could do this as 2.5. You could also do this as x over 2 or theta over 2, and then minus 6. All of those variations would be correct as well. Okay. You do need to simplify the plus a negative to a negative. And then fractions, I tend to default to fractions, but you can use a decimal as well. So that's how we use our previous skill set of finding the min and max, which gets us to the amplitude and midline, and then finding our b value, which is how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. This one between 0 and 2 pi was shorter. It happens to be a quarter. I prefer to use the 2 pi divided by the period, so the period is 1 wavelength. That went to 8 pi, so 2 pi divided by 8 pi. Here we went to 4 pi, so 2 pi divided by 4 pi, the pi is canceled, and then 2/4 reduced to 1/2. Okay. So that, we use those skill sets to get us to our equation.